Welcome back, everyone. And I am pleased to announce our next speaker, who is no stranger to the EMI SIG. In fact, he's presented 23 of the 35 annual meetings. I'm talking about none other than David Freshwater. Mr. Freshwater is an emergency management professional with over 30 years and counting of experience. He joined the Department of Energy Office of Emergency Management as a federal employee in 2007 after supporting the office since 1990 as a contractor for SAIC. Mr. Freshwater is currently the director of the Office of Emergency Management Policy. Prior to this role, he was the Deputy Director for Field Programs within the Office of Emergency Management Programs. He has been involved in the development of each of the updates to the DOE Comprehensive Emergency Management System. He has also assisted in the evaluation of more than 40 emergency exercises and program evaluations conducted both at the headquarters and field levels. Mr. Freshwater is TQP certified and from 1999 to 2004 was credentialed as a certified emergency manager by the International Association of Emergency Management. He received a Bachelor of Science degree from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and undertook graduate studies in technology management. Mr. Freshwater served 11 years of active duty in the Army and completed his military career with more than 15 years service in the active reserves. Mr. Freshwater, take it away.
Good morning. I am David Freshwater, Director of the Office of Emergency Management Policy, NA41. I'm also the sponsor of the Emergency Management Issues Special Interest Group. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 35th annual meeting of the EMI SIG. Contrary to popular belief, I've not been around since the beginning. My first EMI SIG annual meeting was 30 years ago in 1991 in New Orleans. To be young and have a full head of hair again. Over the past 35 years, many organizations have come and gone. Yet the EMI SIG remains the organization for sharing emergency management lessons learned and resources across the DOE complex, addressing major and recurring issues, promoting emerging emergency management technologies, and addressing unforeseen events. This morning, I'm going to discuss where we were, where we are, and where we will be heading. This will essentially be a look back to 2020 and the first virtual annual meeting, as well as looking ahead towards the 2022 annual meeting. We hope that next year we will return to the traditional in-person meeting. You will also hear from John Jusky, the Deputy Associate Administrator for Emergency Operations, the NA40 Deputy. Mr. Jusky will be focusing on events in the strategic planning timeframe the next 3 to 5 years. We also have the honor this morning of being addressed by the Deputy Secretary of Energy, Mr. David Turk. As you know, Mr. Turk is the department's senior emergency management official per DOE Order 151.1D. Mr. Turk will be looking even further forward than Mr. Jusky, but you will hear common themes across all three of our presentations. So where were we a year ago? We were nearly 6 months into the response to the COVID-19 emergency, and we were starting to make plans for returning to the office or returning to work. Even though vaccines were still on the horizon, it seemed as though we had passed through the peaks of the disease. As we know now, there was a much more serious peak that arrived last fall. While some sites had begun to test their emergency response organizations, demonstrating proficiency while masked and socially distanced, most of us still remain in a maximum telework environment. This spring, there was a greater demand for vaccinations than there was supply. It appears now that more doses are available than demand. Yet we have not reached the vaccination goal for herd immunity, and new variants of COVID-19 continue to appear. Even as we return to the office, we will need to remain vigilant to protect workers at our sites. We need to adapt the lessons that we learned over the past year and find other innovative ways to ensure that our emergency management programs are prepared to respond if safety systems fail or natural phenomena events create situations where emergency management must serve as the last line of defense to protect worker and public health and safety and the environment. The past year has been one of multiple changes for the Office of Emergency Operations NA40. A year ago, Jose Barrios made this presentation. Jose has now moved up to the NNSA Office of Policy. This is the first and most obvious change that members of the EMI SIG notice. As you can see from the organization chart, there are changes that affect approximately 40% of the NA40 federal staff. Looking at the top level and the directors, Mr. Jusky became the permanent Deputy Associate Administrator, and Matt Smith recently became the NA40 Chief of Staff. At the director level, as mentioned, Jose Barrios moved up in the NNSA, and I took over as the fourth director of NA41, the fourth director ever, when it was called the Office of Emergency Management and now Emergency Management Policy. Joe Stambaugh, the longtime head of the Consolidated Emergency Operations Center, retired in January. Kevin Moore took over that role. Without mentioning names at the staff level, you can see the changes in red. In NA41, 3 of the staff members came on board within the past 15 months. All may have been on board by the EMI SIG last year. The NA41 deputy position is currently in the final stages of the hiring process. In the Office of Emergency Management Programs, NA42, 2 new staff members joined the headquarters programs branch in the past year. In the field programs branch, in addition to needing to fill the slot that I vacated, 4 of the 6 site liaison officer positions are in the hiring process. And I'll speak more about the site liaison program later in this presentation. The Continuity Programs Division, NA43, filled 1 vacancy caused by retirement in Albuquerque. And finally, the Consolidated Emergency Operations Center, NA44, filled 2 staff positions in the past month, with 2 more vacancies in the final hiring process. The Deputy Director of NA44 position will also be posted for hiring shortly. Working with Human Resources, NA40's goal is to fill the remaining vacancies by September 30th, 2021, essentially in the next 2 months. HR assures us that our goal of reaching full staffing by then is achievable. With all these personnel changes, where is NA40 going in the next year? I'll start with our first priority, the Federal Mission Resiliency Strategy, FMRS. While this is a White House and DHS initiative, NA40, specifically NA43, have provided key support in the development of the strategy to continuously perform essential functions and services without relocating during a disruptive incident. While waiting the executive branch implementation plan to be finalized, we've moved forward in developing the draft DOE implementation plan. NA43 has also moved forward with a revision to the Continuity Programs Order, DOE Order 150.1b. They've completed all actions within the department's formal review and comment system and addressed comments submitted during the review of the order by the Director's Review Board. The Director's Review Board process is not currently finished, but we hope that will occur sometime in the near future, and the order will be published under the Secretary's signature. Communications has been a focus during the past year for NA40. At one point during the COVID-19 emergency, we were sending a senior leadership brief to over 400 separate email addresses each day. Some of those addresses were program or field office distribution lists. We never did determine exactly how many people were getting the senior leadership brief on a daily basis. While we are no longer providing the full senior leadership brief SLB on a daily basis, pertinent COVID information is included in the daily operations brief that come from NA44's watch office staff. The daily operations brief, or DOB, also summarizes the duty staff, response asset deployments, emergency enterprise reports and special events, activities of interest at the DHS National Operations Center, significant weather, and the PMF3 National Energy Picture. When significant events occur, the Watch Office also publishes reports that update leadership on activities that are being performed in the field. Many times, these activities have not risen to the point of being declared an operational emergency. As you know, there are many more media channels now than there were 30 or 35 years ago. Events gather attention outside of the normal reporting chain. I encourage you to recognize that the Watch Office is there for you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They can help you broadly distribute information. You can reach them at 202-586-8100, or you can email them at the address shown on the screen. Another aspect of our communications effort is the revitalization of the Emergency Management Advisory Committee. The EMAC is a federal-only committee that facilitates communication between headquarters and field elements to promptly address emergency management issues. The EMAC is essentially the counterpart to the EMI SIG, where the EMI SIG is contractor-led. Our EMAC meetings dropped off during some organizational changes in NA40, as well as with the COVID emergency. We've now had our second quarterly meeting where readiness assurance was a focus of that meeting. As you know, the Emergency Readiness Assurance Plan, ERAP requirement, goes back nearly 30 years. Annual reports have been written, summaries of information that did not readily provide a picture of the status of an emergency management program at a lab, plant, or site, or could easily be rolled up to give a picture at the program office or at the entire NNSA or the entire DOE levels. In 2019, in conjunction with a working group of NNSA field office and M&O contractors, NA40 developed an emergency readiness assurance program and a reporting tool for that program. The tool was used as part of NNSA's Corporate Performance Evaluation Program, the CPEP, in FY20. We've continued using MRAP and its reporting tool as part of the CPEP in FY21. While COVID delayed our efforts, we are beginning discussions to determine if we can apply this approach across the entire department, simplifying reporting requirements up from the sites and providing timely and leading indicators of emergency management programs across DOE to the DOE leadership. The EMI SIG Emergency Readiness Assurance Subcommittee is also involved in this effort. You'll be hearing more about this over the next year. For years, NA40 has had a program to maintain a level of operational awareness of activities and issues at the lab, plants, and sites, the Site Liaison Officer Program. While there were relationships, and in some cases very close working relationships between NA40 and the field offices, there was not a uniform and standardized approach. We've made a concerted effort over the past year, actually 6 months, developing and publishing both a charter and an SOP for the Site Liaison Officer Program. As we bring new people into NA42 to serve as Site Liaison Officers, there will be more communications with you, both virtually and physically, as we plan to have staff members travel out to the sites and meet with you. The best way to understand the challenges that you meet is for NA40 personnel to see your facilities and have in-person discussions. We hope to report tremendous success in this area next year. In NA41, we hope to make progress on some long-delayed projects this next year. As you may recall, the DOE Guide 151.1-1B entered the department's formal review and comment process at the end of August 2019. All those comments were resolved by January 2020. The guide then went to the Director's Review Board for final approval shortly thereafter. We are working now through our fourth DRB review of Guide 151.1B. We're working with our DRB representative to move this document that does not contain requirements into the completed category. Our DRB representative is also very interested in us closing off this 2-year-long project. When the guide is finally signed out, then we can complete actions on the criteria and review approach document, the CRAD, its associated electronic CRAD or eCRAD, and the integrated requirements document. I know that members of the EMI SIG contributed to the development of these products, and some of you continue field testing the draft products. When the COVID emergency started, we began working on a secretarial memo that would provide flexibility in meeting the requirements in DOE Order 151-1D that were time-specific and were difficult to achieve in a maximum total work environment. Ultimately, the department decided that the authorities and flexibilities that we were requesting for emergency management were granted in a memoranda that the secretary signed regarding safety and security programs. We published a frequently asked question, an FAQ, in January explaining how those memoranda applied and the path forward this year. The return to work, return to the office plan terminology has changed since that FAQ was published. We don't talk about phase 3 anymore, but the principles in the FAQ still apply. Some sites are starting to look at returning to the full requirements of 151-1D in the fiscal year, by the end of fiscal year 2022. For everyone, this should not turn into a long delay for all sites to return to normal. I would also hope that as we do move back to normal, or whatever normal is, that those sites who have not fully implemented DOE Order 151-1D will accomplish that task as well. After all, it's been 5 years since the order was published. As you return to normal at your sites, I also ask that you keep in mind the requirements and guidance related to severe and cascading events. Those requirements and guidance were developed as a result of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, although everyone remembers this as Fukushima. If there's one thing clear about climate change, we ignore Mother Nature at our peril. Deciding that natural phenomena will not have an impact because building codes will ensure that infrastructure remains intact or our safety systems will function is a trap. When the building collapses and safety systems fail, everyone will turn to emergency management. It remains the last line of defense when all other systems fail. We continue to see more intense tornadoes and hurricanes with seasons that last longer. There are drought conditions throughout the country, creating conditions conducive to widespread wildland fires. When these events occur in proximity to your site, it's going to affect the surrounding community and move from one facility at your site to another facility. With COVID having shut down many things, I know that your return to normal is not going to mean immediately plan for a severe or cascading event exercise that would be essentially the equivalent of starting from scratch and running a marathon. Yet you cannot concentrate on single facility training, drills, and exercises and push this off to the end of your 5-year period. Natural phenomena occur regardless of COVID. We could see it every day in the news. You need to reestablish the working relationships across your sites and with your surrounding communities as soon as possible, so that you're ready to respond to a major event. Finally, I commend the EMI SIG. It's possible that during the COVID emergency, it's fostered more creative projects and sharing of information across the complex than we used to see when we had face-to-face annual meetings. I congratulate you for that. Please take this as a challenge to share information both within this annual meeting and in the upcoming year. Learning from others is much easier and better than learning from a mistake that someone else has already made. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you virtually throughout this conference.
Thank you for your sponsorship and for your continued support, Mr. Freshwater. It's been a long time, and we just keep on wanting you around. I'd like to welcome back John Jeske to join you for our headquarters Q&A session. And because it's all about me, that I come up with the first question. You know, we're just fast tracking right to Chief's rule number 5 of you got to have fun. So I'm sure everyone else is going to ask this, but I will start. Can we meet in person at the 36th annual meeting?
Oh, so we're definitely planning for that. There was at one point in time, we actually had the question of whether we could do the 35th annual meeting as a live meeting. There was just enough question about COVID going on And we have such a long timeline to plan the EMI SIG meeting. I'll date myself. This is not like a Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland movie of, hey, let's put on a show. We don't put it on at the last minute. I know that we have to go off and check things and put contracts in place and the rest of that. But we are definitely going to be planning for the 2022 annual meeting as a live meeting, although we will also have a Memorex version because there will be people who can't travel to participate, and we'll make sure that they can be connected in virtually as well.
I think you dated yourself again. What's Memorex? I mean, I'm thinking there are people that have, there's some subcommittee members and chairs that I've never even met in person, and I'm just dying to at least shake their hand. And I'm thinking there's got to be people who've never even met some of their new coworkers with all this turnaround. So that is just a nice thing to have, nice thing to do. And I do miss all the valuable hallway chats and water cooler talks. And yeah, I'll quit. You guys know I have a lot of words to use. I live with 2 introverts, and there's a lot of time to make up. So we do have another question from Sybil Chandler, and a few of them have been liked by her. Can we get a copy of the NA40 organization chart?
Oh, certainly. I mean, we put it in the presentation. When I put that chart together, two and a half weeks ago, and more things change. There's also some additional changes to it since then. So, but we'll update it and we'll figure out how to get it out to everybody in the organization.
Yeah, as this community knows, change is the only constant, and you guys are good at taking it and making it work. That's really the only other question I have, unless there's some new ones coming out. I know this community is not shy. Or maybe I'm just talking about myself. Is there anything that you two wanted to add before we close our opening session?
So Jen, I just think that, Dave's comment about the org chart is just, it goes right hand in hand with what I mentioned with the question that you tossed to me before the DepSec joined on with us. It is something that keeps us awake. We've had incredible amounts of turnover, in the emergency management community, not just in NA40. And, we've been working with our HR counterparts to try to fill all those voids, but we have, we still have a number of vacancies that need to be filled in our shop. And so, yeah, it's just, how do you fill those, in a timely manner? And then how do you fill those voids that are left behind, all of those knowledge voids with all of these incredibly smart people who have gone on to do other things or have retired or what have you. So yeah, the org chart is in a little bit of a state of flux. I think the front office has stabilized quite well. We've got folks in the -1, -2, and chief of staff's positions now that, we know that there's been some turnover there over the past few years, but now we're just trying to stabilize the rest of the NA40 workforce. So, but great question. Thank you.
And we appreciate your efforts on that. And we also appreciate you guys helping us kick off our virtual annual meeting. And hopefully it's our last one. I can't say that enough. But yes, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to end our opening session with a prep talk from Amanda Ripley. Amanda Ripley is a journalist and a senior fellow at the Emerson Collective. She is the author, most recently, of The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way. That's a good one for parents out there. A New York Times bestseller. Her first book, The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why, was described by NPR as the thinking person's manual for getting out alive. The Unthinkable was published in 15 countries and turned into a PBS documentary. Amanda has written feature stories about disasters, education, and human behavior for Time magazine, The Atlantic, Politico, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and The Times of London. Her work helped Time magazine win 2 National Magazine Awards. And you might be wondering, why Amanda Ripley? Well, it's because her book happens to be the current subject of the Stars Book Club. You might want to check in. It's really good. And it looks like we have some last minute questions. So let me hold here, be flexible, change with it. And I've got some questions. So I'm glad you guys didn't leave yet. We have one from Daniel Gleaves. Has there been any discussion on direct funding given the future increase in COOP requirements based on the new order?
So I'm happy to take that. Yeah, so that's a great question. We are looking at ways to monetize, if you will, the requirements coming out of the new order. So if you're talking, I'm assuming we're talking about the federal mission resilience strategies. So recognizing that the new kind of paradigm looks at an assess, distribute, sustain model, which is kind of a distributed footprint. And then all of the kind of requirements that would flow from that sort of a distributed footprint. When I think about it, I think about communications requirements. If we're looking at a workforce that rather than everybody picks up and goes to a specific site for COOP, instead now we're distributed across the landscape, how are we going to be communicating with each other? So I think comms is huge. The infrastructure to support the comms is huge. And so it's funny, we actually had a meeting on the calendar coincident with this time with the leadership of NA40 to talk through kind of monetizing the requirements of FMRS. And we're putting together kind of that punch list of what we think we need. The reason there's some kind of nebulous nature to my answer is because we're really waiting for the White House to provide some more specific guidance. There is an implementation plan for FMRS that's in a draft form right now. We've been in meetings every week with the White House talking through what that looks like, how that document could help us kind of determine what our infrastructure should look like going forward to support FMRS. So there's still work to be done there, but rather than waiting for that to cross the finish line, we are getting out ahead of it and putting what we think the price tags would be on some of those infrastructure improvements that are needed. So there is money already kind of carved out as a UFR, an unfunded requirement going forward. We recognize this is a sort of unfunded mandate. And so there is money that's been teed up that we're requesting in future years, but it's a little premature to really talk about the details of that at this point.
Thank you for that. And I'm trying to remember what Mr. Freshwater always says, give a little pause. Here is one more question that we have. Can you talk about the future of the ERAP? Is it going away?
So I think that's one that I have to take. All right, so last month, I think it was July 20th, we had a meeting of the Emergency Management Advisory Committee. That's the federal people that advise NA40 on issues. And the topic of that meeting actually was about readiness assurance. And so the annual report, the ERAP, were all topics of discussion within that framework. Unfortunately, because of the way the timing is, we don't have any decisions for that. There are some recommendations that we may be talking about in the meeting that comes in October. And of course, the cut date for the ERAP is September 30th. So for this year, we're still going to do the ERAP. We are not making any changes to the format. So the format that's up in EDMS that was there for last year is the same format we're going to use. If you've been using EDMS, great, please continue that. Thank you. If you haven't been using EDMS, if you've been sending it to us as a PDF file electronically, or those few people who do send us the hard copy, please consider using EDMS. It's easier for you and it's a lot easier for us. But we'll just continue with that. If we're going to change what information we're going to extract to put into the annual report, I believe everything is in the ERAP that we would need. If you know or aware of this, in the National Nuclear Security and the NNSA, we went to something called the Emergency Management Readiness Assurance Program and a reporting tool. It's a much smaller number of questions. I think it's 15, if I remember the number correctly. We do those things 3 times a year. It's part of the evaluation of the contractor that goes into setting their performance fee each year. We were talking about and trying to roll that across into DOE this year. Those discussions are underway. Maybe in the future, the ERAP becomes the MRAP reporting tool. It gives us a dashboard. It's something simpler, and it doesn't have all the data that you've had there. But it's something we're working on after we work on it with the federal people. We're going to be talking to the contractors and talking to the contractors through the ERASC as well.
Thank you very much. I believe I've paused enough. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, let's get back. As a reminder, Amanda Ripley, her book, The Unthinkable, is the current feature in the STARS Book Club. And in her prep talk, she combines the inspiring stories of disaster survivors with research into how the brain works when confronted with unusual events. She explains that unless we have had the experience or the training to help us act quickly during moments of great peril, our instinctive response may be the worst possible reaction. If you'd like to continue this talk with your cohorts, please download the Unthinkable discussion guide. This will be available in our app. And we look forward to seeing you after lunch at 12:30 my time, which is the Mountain Time, or at your local time, for our pandemic response and recovery panel, moderated by our very own EMI SIG Steering Committee Vice Chair, going to be the new chair for the new term, Daniel Gleaves of Pantex. For now, please enjoy this prep talk by Amanda Ripley, and we'll see you after lunch.
I spent 10 years as a reporter for Time magazine covering all kinds of disasters. And one of the things that I noticed was over time, in everything from terrorist attacks to anthrax to wildfires, all kinds of different disasters, I heard the most interesting and surprising things from the survivors of those incidents. And they were not the things that we were mostly writing about in many of our stories. Usually we turn to survivors for stories of loss and blame and tragedy, which are important to witness. But what I was also hearing was another story, which was things that survivors had learned that they wanted you to know. Sometimes very practical things. They had experienced physically, emotionally, even socially, things that they did not expect in the moments leading up to, during, and after a disaster. And it was remarkable how similar their stories were from very different disasters. And yet, very little of that wisdom seemed to be influencing the larger conversations we were having in officialdom about preparedness and planning, and the general narrative about what happens in disasters. So I want to talk first about what we expect happens, including the media, and then we'll talk about what actually happens through the story of one survivor. If you look back, almost every major disaster, there's inevitably a media report that marvels at the lack of panic, right? And almost always attributes this stoicism or calm to a cultural oddity of the place where the disaster took place. This was The Economist actually congratulating Americans for their stoicism, which I thought was hilarious. The Economist doesn't typically laud America for its stoicism compared to the UK, but nevertheless, after Hurricane Harvey, this appeared. Natural disasters bring out Americans' sterling civic spirit, stoicism, and selflessness. All true. The thing is, this happens everywhere. So let me give you an example. This was after the Boston Marathon bombings, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette lauded the stoic, resilient spirit that pervades this city, just that city. And then we see it sometimes entire countries, many different languages and cultures. So the Chinese can be very stoic in the face of a disaster. And here we have everywhere Japan's stoic resilience is on display. This is my favorite. Outside the hotel is a line of locals waiting patiently, as perhaps only Japanese people can. So, while it's very nice that we in the media are congratulating these survivors on their calm, we need to start connecting the dots and realizing that this is the norm. This is the default reaction. In general, people do not behave as they behave at rush hour on the freeway in disasters. Very different dynamics immediately take hold. So I want to talk a little bit about what actually happens through what survivors have told me. And I think one thing I wanted to start with was by just noting my appreciation for these survivors. This is Christian, who came to me after my book, The Unthinkable, came out, because he wanted to share his story as a warning for the rest of us. So like all survivors, he wanted his story to be worth something. So Christian was living in Singapore. He was from Belgium. And in 2004, he knew he was going to be very homesick, away from his family, where he grew up. So he invited a group of friends to go to Thailand for the holidays. And this is him on a boat approaching this tiny island where he would be staying for Christmas. It's a beautiful place that was made famous by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie The Beach, if you ever saw it. But it's a very tiny island on a strip of land, as you can see. A beautiful place. He had a wonderful time with his friends. And the morning after Christmas, he was awakened by some slight shaking of an earthquake around 8:30 a.m. in his hotel room. He knew it was an earthquake because he had experience that was relevant. He had lived in Los Angeles at some point and pretty much had a good idea of what that feeling was. So he got up and immediately went over to the window and stared out at the sea. So he had a little more information, which was valuable, which was that sometimes tsunami come after earthquakes. And he stared at the sea for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then, looking for the kind of wall of water that he was expecting from movies, and he didn't see anything, so he decided he was being silly, and he went down to breakfast and really didn't think too much about it anymore after that. So what we find in most disasters is that this is very, very typical, that your brain, as Dennis alluded to, will go to great lengths to come up with ways to normalize a situation, even when you have a little more wisdom about what may or may not be the risk. Firefighters have great stories about this. If you know a firefighter, ask them. They will tell you about going into a bar or a department store or a movie theater and watching smoke fill the ceiling and everybody's just sitting there and looking at you. So this is a very common thing where it's totally understandable, right? You will try to fit what is happening into patterns for everything that's happened before. That is how we function, right? We cannot get through the day without that. So the problem is if we don't have training and experience then in a particular emergency, then we will try to do that. We all do it, even people with training do this. So this is a picture that was taken moments before the tsunami, a couple hours after Christian woke up. He had gone up to his room to pack and check out. And around this time, there was a second natural warning sign of a possible tsunami. In addition to an earthquake, a warning sign that sometimes occurs is that the sea begins behaving strangely. So recedes, become very shallow, frothy, sort of churning. And people, the tourists on the beach, notice this. In many cases, discussed it with each other, which is the milling that Dennis was talking about. It's very common for people to become very social in these situations and want to share information. And they're in fact walking towards the water because there isn't enough latent wisdom in this crowd about what this might indicate. So here is an opportunity, right? If people knew when they checked into their hotel rooms in a tsunami inundation zone that this was a sign of a possible tsunami, then this would have been a very useful moment, right? This deliberation. In the case of Christian, he was packing his bag, not thinking anything was wrong, in this beautiful place, when he suddenly heard a loud slam, and he felt the impact of the water against his building. He was on the second floor of a relatively flimsy two-story building, and he noticed that the lights went out in his room, And he heard some strange noises. You can see this is a picture taken during the tsunami somewhere else in Thailand. You can see in the upper left corner a picture of the water approaching, people running away. But even then, he tried to make sense of it and to normalize it, which is what we all do. I've caught myself doing it many, many times. So in his case, he came up with the narrative that perhaps there were some guests checking out and their rolling suitcases had banged into something, and that's what had created the disruption. Apparently, the power had been cut off by this too. So he continued packing. And then he went to the bathroom and went to wash his hands, and then no water came out. Now, this was enough to trigger a sense that maybe everything wasn't as normal as he thought. So he opened the door from his room to see what was going on, and the water was about 2 inches below the second floor where his room was. And here's what's interesting. In this moment, he looks around. There's water everywhere. The restaurant where he'd just eaten breakfast is gone. Just everything is covered. And what his brain did was sort and try to find an explanation that it had experienced before. And the only thing he could think of was that it was similar to when it would snow in his native country of Belgium. And you'd walk outside and it was so still and peaceful and quiet. This is a very powerful thought. It was just like a snow day. And it was dead silent. And there were some people, just like him, looking out, trying to make sense of what was happening. And so they went from this stage of denial and disbelief into a stage of deliberation or milling, where they started talking to each other, shouting to each other. Do you think this was a tsunami? Christian said. And they all agreed that it probably was. But it was nothing like he had expected. It was very quiet. People were very calm or stoic. They did not panic. They did not get hysterical. They did not start punching each other out. They needed each other quite desperately. So why would they do that, right? So in his case, the water quickly receded, and you can see this is a picture he took just moments after the tsunami. And the destruction was unimaginable. Half the population, there were 5,000 people on that island, half of them were dying. And his mind slowly began to absorb what was happening. And he grabbed a backpack that had a first aid kit and started trying to find survivors and administer first aid. And it was a very difficult, as you can imagine, traumatic experience for everyone involved. He went back to Singapore, back to his life, and couldn't do that, couldn't reconcile it. So he started a charity that built boats for fishermen who had been displaced by the tsunami. And he lives to this day with a lot of guilt because he had this moment where he went to the window and he thought, maybe there's going to be a tsunami, and he didn't act on it. And that's why he wants to tell this story. Now, what I tell Christian is, wouldn't it have been nice if you'd gotten a message, a warning message, or someone had given you this information? It's not just on you, but it feels like it's just on you. And what he wants you to know is, if you're in charge of emergency management, you need to deputize that information. You need to make sure everybody in your office building knows what the warning signs are and that they've gone down the stairs and they've trained for it physically. If you don't do that, he said, you will not want to live with yourself afterward. You need to trust people with as much knowledge as you can give them and as much physical muscle memory of getting out of a place as they will allow you to introduce them to. Because you don't want to have to think in a disaster. It will not go well. It is not how our brains are designed. To deal with new, unrecognizable patterns under stress is almost impossible to behave quickly. So knowing this, there are things we can do. We know that we can train for these 3 phases that most people go through, right? We can develop warnings and emergency plans expecting there to be a period of denial, followed by a period of deliberation, followed by a decisive moment where you take action, or, as is much more common, you do not take action. Much more common than panic is what the airlines call negative panic, which is a sort of lethargy or freezing, which again, there are good evolutionary reasons for doing that, depending on the disaster. So these are the things we know and we can plan for. As a counterpoint, Christian wanted me to talk about a little girl, much like him, who was from the UK, visiting a place she'd never been at the same exact moment in Thailand. So similar to him in a lot of ways, similar level of privileges and advantages, education, although she was 10. But she was there with her family on holiday. And she was walking down the beach this same morning, and she noticed how the sea was behaving strangely. And she had, in her science class back home, recently learned about the warning signs of a tsunami. And Tilly turned to her parents and she said, I think there's going to be a tsunami. The sea is, it's shallow, it's frothy. This is one way you know there's going to be a tsunami. And her parents did what most of us would do without that knowledge and tried to tell her everything was fine, to calm her down, to make sure, she didn't freak out. And they kept walking. And at some point, Tilly sat down in the sand and refused to go on because she was so convinced that there's something wrong. There's two things about this. The first is the incredible power of just a little bit of information, and the second is the incredible courage of children. Children are wide open to this stuff, which is why firefighters are constantly showing up at schools, right? Children are open to this. They're not as likely to fit everything into pre-existing narratives because they don't have as many cluttering up their brains, right? And they're not as worried about being embarrassed, to their great credit. So her father agreed to take her back to the hotel. The mother went on walking on the beach. And they get to the hotel, and now this is where the deliberation, the social part happens. So her father does something very brave, which is he turns to one of the Marriott employees and he says, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but my daughter is worried there's going to be a tsunami because the sea is doing this weird thing, and which everyone had noticed, and she heard that could be a warning sign. And it happened that there was a Japanese tourist standing right there and overheard him and said, I read that there was an earthquake in Sumatra earlier, so it could be that there is going to be a tsunami. She might have a point. And together, the three of them discussed it and then did something very courageous, which is they cleared the beach. They screamed and yelled and got everybody, including Tilly's mother, back. And they went to a higher floor, and no one died on the beach that day. This was a very difficult story for Christian to read because he felt like he could have done that, right? This 10-year-old girl did this. But the point is we did it together, right? Like her teacher did it. Her father did it. The Marriott employee did it. And this is the kind of thing that we know, everyone in this room knows, that it is regular people, your friends and families and coworkers and hotel workers who will be there for you in a disaster. So our best chance is to trust them more with more information sooner, more transparency than we're comfortable with. Then we know we're doing it right. Thank you all so much for listening. It is a true honor to be here with you today. It's very difficult to have any true north, right? Most disasters, very difficult to know what's going to happen. I was interested to sit in on the Metropolitan Police Department here in Washington, D.C. has started giving briefings specifically on active shooters to offices and places that are interested. And I was thinking to myself, what are they gonna say? Like, this is a tough one, But it's very impressive, actually, that they're dealing with this head on. And they gave a presentation which basically said, the kind of buzzwords that you hear, which are run, hide, fight for a active shooter. But they explained specifically what that might look like and gave people a sense of agency. And then, the more you kind of have a sense of what you can do, the less likely it is that fear will shut down your response, right? There's like a zone with fear. And a little is good. Too much, you begin to really have cognitive and physical decline, right? So in that case, they were able to come up with very specific things that to this day I think about, like grab a fire extinguisher, there are things in your office that you can use. You don't want to think about this stuff, right? But it is much better than thinking about yourself as just a helpless victim, even if you are, right? So there is value in giving people a sense of agency, in reminding them of the value in running and hiding before fighting, but that at some point they may have to fight and not to expect someone to come save them. And that was the message the police were sending. And it's distressing that we're at that point, but it's better to give people a sense of options and their own power, such as it is, than to not talk about it. On average, people in the World Trade Center waited 6 minutes before beginning their evacuation. There were lots of good reasons for that, but some people waited much, much longer. Some people got misinformation from the Port Authority telling them to stay. So it's always really tricky. We know that people who have experience with past disasters, anecdotally, also people who have military experience, again, anecdotally, in my interviews, those people tended to react more quickly because they had something to work with and they had a sense of their own role, the way that they could influence events. They knew intrinsically in their bones that things could go very badly very quickly. Knowing that can be a burden, but it can also empower you to take action and push through that phase. We mentioned Scully earlier, the pilot who landed the commercial airplane in the Hudson River. Do you remember this in Manhattan? And even who's a very experienced pilot, he said in his first interview with Katie Couric, he said, when those engines went out, my first thought was, this can't be happening. I had it in my head that I would not one day land a commercial airplane in the water. So even he has this moment, and most emergency responders, soldiers, everybody goes through this phase. If you know to expect it, you can kind of push. You can actually recognize yourself going through it and push faster. The things that also influence are the people around you, right? So if people scream at you to get out, then you're more likely to kind of snap out of that stupor. So I went to some flight attendant training for this research, and they are now trained in the best of cases to yell at passengers, not to, because what will happen is most plane crashes are survivable and they end up on the ground, the plane's on fire, you need to get off very quickly, the smoke's very toxic. So the whole game is moving through that denial phase really quickly, right? But you have no experience for this, right? Like you got nothing. So what happens is people immediately, even when the cabin is filled with smoke and something terrifying has just happened, people will go for their overhead bags, right? And that's because that's what we always do when we get off the plane. So they've trained flight attendants to scream at you not to do that, to leave your bags, to go, 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 and that does help. A lot of first responders do this as well. They will use very direct language in very intense situations, and it's not because they're really angry. It's because that helps break through this kind of lethargy. But there are many, many stories of individuals grabbing the hand of the person next to them and saying, we're getting out of here. And that breaks through the stupor. So again, really depends on the people you're with and the training and wisdom they all have combined. The survivors I talk to, I very explicitly talk to survivors who have already talked to the media. I don't like to re-traumatize people who aren't ready or interested in talking, so I'm kind of self-selecting for survivors who have maybe processed this in a certain way and are more either able or interested in kind of moving to try to help others. But so I can't speak to all survivors, but the ones that I did talk to, yes, definitely. They very much want to share these stories. They often will reach out to survivors of very different new disasters as they come because they can really feel a connection to that. In the case of Christian, when he was back in Thailand, he ended up leaving his life in Singapore, working on this, building this charity. And one night he was driving home late, and it was maybe a year after the tsunami, and it was, dark rural roads, and a bus had tumbled into a ravine in an accident. And all these cars had pulled over, and people were just sort of staring, and there were 40 people on this bus. Almost half of them had died instantly, but there were a lot of survivors. And in this case, because of his experience, Christian immediately pushed through that phase of just staring and wondering and trying to make sense of it. And he started yelling at people to help the survivors. And he got as many survivors as he could into his vehicle and other people's vehicles, and they had to drive 45 minutes to the nearest hospital. But there was this one moment, and he describes it as one of the few moments where he really felt some peace since the tsunami, when he looked in his rearview mirror and he saw a convoy of cars behind him because they were following him. And this is what we know. People will become unbelievably compliant and obedient and courteous in a disaster. So if there is a vocal, wise leader, they will follow.